Mansa Musa had left his golden kingdom behind, but his journey north across the Sahara was only the beginning. Ahead of him lay Cairo, one of the greatest cities in the medieval world, and it had no idea what was coming. In the summer of 1324, the streets of Cairo witnessed something its merchants, scholars, and sultans had never seen before and would never see again. A foreign king arrived at their gates not merely to trade, but to give, endlessly, extravagantly, almost recklessly. Every beggar who approached him left with gold. Every scholar who impressed him left with gold. Every mosque he visited received gold. Historians who studied the event centuries later discovered something almost unbelievable. The sheer volume of gold Mansa Musa distributed during his brief stay in Cairo was so massive that it flooded the local market, crashed the value of gold itself, and caused an economic depression that lasted more than a decade. A single man, passing through a single city, on his way to a religious pilgrimage, had accidentally triggered one of the first recorded instances of hyperinflation in world history. This is the story of the journey that made the world finally understand just how rich Mansa Musa really was. By the time Mansa Musa's caravan crossed out of his own territory and pressed north through the vast emptiness of the Sahara, it had already grown into something the medieval world had rarely witnessed. Arab chroniclers who later attempted to document the journey, most notably the Syrian historian al-Amari, who interviewed officials in Cairo just a few years after Musa passed through, described a procession of almost incomprehensible scale. Estimates recorded in various chronicles range from tens of thousands of people to numbers that modern historians consider exaggerated for rhetorical effect. But even the most conservative modern estimates describe a caravan of many thousands. Soldiers to provide protection along dangerous desert routes, officials and administrators, religious scholars, griots and court musicians, and merchants who traveled to trade along the way. Camels numbering in the hundreds, by some accounts over 100, carried provisions, tents, and, most importantly, gold. The gold itself was staggering in both quantity and presentation. Chronicles describe enslaved attendants, dressed in fine Persian silk, walking beside the Mansa carrying golden staffs. Other accounts describe horses and camels laden with sacks of gold dust and bars, intended not for trade in the conventional sense, but for display, for religious charity, and for diplomatic gift-giving along the entire route. This was not simply a wealthy man traveling with his fortune. This was a calculated demonstration of imperial power, designed to announce to the Islamic world that Mali was not a peripheral, unknown kingdom on the edge of the map, but one of its wealthiest and most sophisticated civilizations. The caravan's route took it through the oasis towns of the Sahara and along established trade corridors toward Cairo, one of the largest and most important cities in the medieval world, and the seat of the Mamluk Sultanate. Cairo at the time was a global hub of trade, scholarship, and Islamic governance, a city of hundreds of thousands of residents, bustling markets, grand mosques, and a sophisticated bureaucratic and financial system. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of city equipped to notice and to be shaken by what Mansa Musa was about to do. According to al-Amari's account, when Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo, the reigning Mamluk Sultan, al-Nasir Muhammad, initially expected the visiting African king to observe standard diplomatic protocol and personally pay homage to him, as was customary for foreign rulers passing through Mamluk territory. Musa, however, reportedly resisted this expectation for some time, a subtle but telling assertion of his own status as a sovereign equal rather than a subordinate visitor. Eventually, a compromise was reportedly reached, and the two rulers met with appropriate ceremony. But the episode itself reveals something important. Musa did not see himself and did not intend to be seen as a minor provincial king paying tribute to a greater power. He arrived as an equal, and he intended to prove it through the sheer scale of his generosity. What followed, over the course of his roughly 3-month stay in the city, became legendary. Musa distributed gold with what chroniclers described as extraordinary, almost indiscriminate generosity. He gave gold to the poor who lined the streets to see his procession. He gave gold to local officials and dignitaries as diplomatic gifts. He gave gold to scholars and religious leaders whose company and counsel he sought during his stay, and he purchased goods in the markets at prices far above their asking value, apparently uninterested in negotiating, because negotiating was beneath a man of his station. Some accounts describe him funding the construction or renovation of mosques during his brief time in the city. By every surviving account, Mansa Musa's approach to spending money in Cairo was less like a tourist and more like a force of nature. The consequences were almost immediate, and they were severe. Gold, at its core, derives value from its scarcity. When Mansa Musa flooded Cairo's markets with an enormous, sudden influx of gold he was giving away freely rather than trading for goods or services in a balanced exchange. Its relative value collapsed. Prices for ordinary goods across Cairo spiked dramatically because merchants and moneylenders now needed far more gold to purchase the same items they had sold cheaply before Musa's arrival. Historical and modern economic analyses of the period estimate that the value of gold in Cairo and the surrounding region remained suppressed for as long as 12 years after Musa's visit, a staggering, multi-decade economic aftershock caused by the spending habits of a single traveling monarch. Some modern economists have pointed to this episode as one of the earliest well-documented examples in world history of a demand-side shock producing sustained inflation, a case study still referenced in discussions of monetary economics today. It is worth pausing here to consider what this actually means. This was not merely a rich man spending lavishly. This was an individual whose personal wealth was large enough, relative to the entire monetary gold supply of one of the medieval world's greatest economic centers, to visibly distort that economy for over a decade. There is no equivalent in the modern world. No contemporary billionaire spending, however extravagant, could single-handedly crash a national currency simply by visiting a country and giving gifts. This single fact, more than any other, is why modern historians and economists, when asked to identify the richest person in recorded human history, so often arrive at the same name, Mansa Musa. His time in Cairo also had consequences beyond economics. He forged relationships with scholars, judges, and religious authorities, and it was here that he began recruiting men who would permanently transform his empire. Among them was the Andalusian poet and architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who Musa reportedly persuaded, with substantial payment, to return with him to West Africa. Al-Sahili would go on to design and construct some of Mali's most famous architectural landmarks, blending North African and Andalusian building techniques, including the distinctive use of fired brick and pyramidal minarets, with West African materials and traditions. From Cairo, Musa continued on to complete the core purpose of his journey. The Hajj itself, traveling onward to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina to fulfill the religious pilgrimage required of Muslims. Details of this portion of his journey are less thoroughly documented than his time in Cairo, but chroniclers agree that he continued to distribute charity and gifts along the route, and that his reputation and the reputation of the Mali Empire spread rapidly through the pilgrim communities he encountered from across the Islamic world, from Persia to Iberia. Pilgrims returning to their own homelands carried stories of the astonishingly wealthy African king, and those stories began to travel far beyond the Islamic world entirely. Within a matter of years, cartographers in Europe began incorporating Mali and its legendary ruler into their maps of the known world. The most famous of these is the Catalan Atlas of 1375, produced in Majorca, which depicts a crowned African king seated on a golden throne, holding a golden orb and scepter, with an inscription identifying him as the Lord of the Negroes of Guinea, whose wealth in gold was so abundant that he was the richest and most noble king in all the land. This map, created decades after Musa's death, is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for just how far and how permanently his reputation traveled, from a single pilgrimage through Cairo to the imagination of European mapmakers who had never set foot anywhere near West Africa. Musa eventually began his return journey home, retracing much of his route and continuing to spend, gift, and recruit scholars and architects along the way. But he did not leave Cairo unscathed, in a purely economic sense. According to some later accounts, by the time he departed the city on his return journey, Musa had given away so much gold that he was forced to borrow funds from Cairo's moneylenders at high interest simply to finance the remainder of his journey home. A detail that, if accurate, is almost darkly comic. The richest man in the world, temporarily out of liquid gold, borrowing money to get home. Whether this detail is entirely accurate or an embellishment added by later chroniclers eager to illustrate the scale of his spending, it captures something essential about the legend that had already begun to form around him. A man whose wealth was so vast and so freely given that even he could momentarily run short. When Mansa Musa finally returned to his own empire, he brought back more than religious fulfillment. He brought back architects, scholars, and books that would transform Timbuktu into one of the great centers of Islamic learning in the world. He brought back a reputation that had permanently altered how the rest of the world understood Africa. And he brought back the knowledge that his kingdom, for all its wealth, could reshape the economic reality of one of the greatest cities on earth, simply by passing through it. What he built with that reputation and what became of his empire after his return is the story of Part 3. Mansa Musa returned home a legend, his empire now etched permanently onto the maps of the world. But legends fade, empires shift, and even the richest kingdom on earth would soon face the forces of time, succession, and forgetting.